We regard this as an investigation which could become a clear criminal investigation.
On October 5th, 2001, almost a month after the September 11th terrorist attacks on New York City, the Pentagon, and western Pennsylvania, terror of another type struck. Robert Stevens, a 63-year-old photo editor from Boca Raton, Florida, died from inhalation anthrax.
Today, there's been another case of, reported case of anthrax.
Within a few weeks, 17 more people would be diagnosed with anthrax. 4 more would die. Other media headquarters in New York, Senate office buildings on Capitol Hill, and postal facilities along the East Coast would all become contaminated with anthrax spores, sending an already anxious nation into a panic over possible nationwide bioterrorism attacks. Anthrax is an acute infectious disease caused by a spore-forming bacterium. The 3 forms of human anthrax are inhalation, cutaneous, and intestinal. The most serious is inhalation, where initial symptoms may resemble a common cold. After several days, the symptoms may progress to severe breathing problems, shock, and death. Fortunately, early antibiotic treatment is an effective remedy in most cases. Mr. Stevens was an employee of tabloid publisher American Media Incorporated. With the discovery of anthrax spores in his workspace, the county health department quarantined the building and AMI workers were tested for anthrax. The FBI took control of the property and, along with the Center for Disease Control, or CDC, began an investigation that revealed anthrax had probably entered the building via mail addressed to Mr. Stevens. With the collection of criminal evidence complete, U.S. EPA Region 4 was requested to assist in a comprehensive sampling program to determine the extent of contamination, which would help determine an eventual decontamination plan for the 68,000 square foot building.
Fortunately, we were able to still deal with this like we do all emergencies that are outlined in the National Contingency Plan. You still have to do site assessment, you still have to do sampling, and then you still have to take that data and determine your cleanup options. In this case, we're dealing with a bio instead of a chemical or an oil. Once we were able to develop the protocol for this response, things moved along rather routinely.
Although the site could be handled in a relatively routine manner, there were some unique aspects to be considered requiring the development of sampling protocols.
Well, the first unusual thing about the sampling was getting people qualified that could do the sampling. We requested the aid of the Civil Support Team out of Florida and the Gulf Strike Team out of Mobile, and we trained them in how to take bio samples.
The EPA's Environmental Response Team provided training on sampling procedures to the state and federal responders. The 44th Civil Support Team is a Florida National Guard unit with specialized chemical and biological warfare training. The U.S. Coast Guard Gulf Strike Team has a long history of assisting EPA OSCs on emergency responses.
We brought a total of 12 people down on our team. We set up a mobile command post for the FOSC to use for meetings, conferences, and administrative work. We set up the decontamination line. We're going to be performing entries. We have a site safety officer, industrial hygienist working for the OSC.
The strike team also brought in health service technicians to perform blood sampling and medical monitoring.
Excellent.
NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, also assisted with the selection of personal protective equipment and the development of sampling equipment, techniques, and plans.
Our mission and role here is to provide support to help better characterize the building from an environmental standpoint so we can understand where the contamination is. We're going to be collecting air samples, surface samples, and vacuum samples. in a number of different techniques to try and characterize the environment. We're going to start in areas where we think may be less contaminated and systematically work towards areas that we know to be contaminated in the hope that we can isolate areas of the building that we can verify as contaminant-free.
The Agency for Toxic Substance Disease Registry, or ATSDR, was also on site to assess the presence and nature of any health hazards and to help prevent or reduce any further exposure to the public and responders.
We basically liaisoned with NIOSH and the federal occupational health doctors that work with EPA to develop a medical monitoring program, which basically did a pre-serology before we did any entry, nasal swabs pre and post to determine if any breakthrough is occurring with our respirators, and then a post-serology 30 days afterwards. The federal occupational health docs came over and provided us training on site on basically what anthrax was, what are the symptoms, how can you become contracted with the disease, and if you are on prophylactics, what are the two options we had and what are the side effects for them.
The health and safety plan called for responders entering the anthrax-infected zone to undergo a course of antibiotics for 60 days from their most recent exposure. As events unfolded, the need for sampling and decontamination at several local post offices where contaminated mail had been processed was identified. The mail sorting machines where samples had revealed anthrax spores led the team to some interesting discoveries.
How do they clean these machines? They're using vacuum cleaners. Okay, well, let's check the vacuum cleaners. Were these shop vacs contaminated? Well, yes, they were. A couple of them were. Those that came back when we sampled them came back with hits for anthrax. We basically took them out of service and removed them.
Results of the 462 swab and air samples collected inside the AMI building revealed trace levels of anthrax at 84 sample locations on the first floor lobby, library, stairs, elevator, and several countertops.
That data has now been turned over to the AMI management for them to develop the cleanup options. EPA will continue to provide technical oversight and consultation in order to complete the cleanup at the facility.
Lessons learned and the techniques and procedures used in Florida, as well as the events that were quickly unfolding on Capitol Hill, were reviewed and quickly packaged into a 2-day training course for EPA OSCs and other state and federal responders. Hosted by EPA's Environmental Response Team and staged in all 10 EPA regions, the course presented bioterrorism experts from the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute for Infectious Diseases, health and safety specialists from ATSDR, and EPA on-scene coordinators experienced in anthrax site management. Besides classroom instruction, participants received hands-on training in sampling and decontamination techniques specific to biological warfare agents. The training would be especially useful to responders headed to Capitol Hill, where on October 15th, another anthrax-tainted letter was opened in the office of Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle. Within 2 days, anthrax spores were discovered in 5 more offices in the Hart Senate building, where Daschle's suite is located. Thousands of the building staffers and visitors were tested for anthrax exposure, and hundreds were placed on a 60-day prescription of antibiotics. Teams of scientists from the EPA, CDC, NIOSH, DOD, and other agencies began sampling buildings across Capitol Hill. The 1 million square foot Hart building, where half of the 100 U.S. senators keep office, was shut down. A command post was established, and a cleanup began that went 24/7 for 3 months and required the services of hundreds of federal employees and environmental contractors.
It was a very dynamic situation, people arriving, people leaving, different responsibilities and roles. But finally, after about a week, had the Coast Guard institute an incident command structure. Things began to stabilize. The Coast Guard added a lot of structure to our operation.
One of the things the National Strike Force brings to bear and does is we can do the smaller things that we all know really help a site move along, and work with the EPA OSC as a partner in helping to think through those issues. We're really writing the book here. This is totally new ground. But we're trying to manage all those by staying with fundamentals. You focus on the fundamentals of entries, you focus on protecting your respiratory, your dermal, you assess your hazards, you have your rest periods, you have site control, you try to work those things.
Dr. Douglas Stutz, a former executive officer with the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, with over 25 years of experience in emergency response, toxicology, and immunology, was appointed incident commander.
As we went through the process, we actually investigated 28 major buildings on the campus. We sampled what we called following the mail trail, where we would go in and look at where mail would have been delivered, and based upon that try to follow it to where it might have gone within offices or hallways or mail rooms to see if in fact there was another letter or if in fact there had been contamination. And we did find it, and we found it in several of the other buildings, including the main warehouse where we received mail for the Congress, and then we found it in several of the congressional buildings as well. And in most cases, it was a trace level, with the exception of the Hart building. In that building, we have found large quantities. Of course, that's where the letter was open.
Once we obtained enough data to feel we had determined where the spores had been distributed and how well they were isolated in certain areas, we designed different approaches for those areas.
Because anthrax had never been decontaminated from an area of this magnitude before, experimental cleanup technologies had to be considered. After 8 weeks of testing at the Brentwood Postal Facility by EPA's Environmental Response Team, fumigation with chlorine dioxide gas, or ClO2, was chosen as the fastest, most productive, and least destructive process.
Although the product, the disinfectant, is used in food and water disinfection, it's used in the oil field to help get more oil out of the ground, it's never been used like this. So it's an experiment, but it's a valid experiment, and we are going to, I think, be able to show a new way to handle this kind of an assault from a biological organism.
The process required a labor-intensive layout of electrical cabling, ducting, and apparatus in the building, and sealing vents, doors, windows, and ceiling spaces in the treatment area. Here's how the process works. The gas won't be effective unless the environment is warm and moist. Steam is pumped into the suite until humidity levels reach between 70 and 80%. Meanwhile, the chlorine dioxide gas is generated in an aqueous solution outside the building. The solution is then delivered via piping to the office, where an air stripper emits the ClO2 into a gaseous state. It is then distributed in the suite using ducting and fans. The process delivers a uniform concentration and thorough treatment throughout the contaminated area, including ceiling spaces, carpeting, and furniture. 3,000 spore test strips were prepared to place in the Daschle suite to evaluate the fumigation's effectiveness.
The spore test strips are believed in some cases to be hardier than the anthrax spore. And we have known numbers of spores that are attached to these strips, 10 to the 6th, 10 to the 7th, 10 to the 8th. They're located throughout the suite in areas that we believe gas might be hard to get to. And the idea is that we want to be able to assure that we've got the destruction that we need.
Finally, on Friday, November 30th, Capitol Hill Police secured the surrounding streets, and employees in the adjoining Dirksen building were sent home early so the system could be put through its paces. By 2 a.m., humidity had reached target levels, and ClO2 was pumped into the building. EPA's Environmental Response Team performed perimeter air monitoring as a precautionary measure to ensure that the surrounding public was not at risk of exposure to any fugitive emissions of ClO2. ERT's TAGA, or Trace Atmosphere Gas Analyzer bus, also circled the site, collecting real-time air samples in the low parts per billion. During the fumigation process, chemists from the chlorine dioxide industry conducted on-site analytical tests to measure the concentrations of ClO2 inside.
They are analyzing on a frequency of minutes samples obtained from the suite during the chlorine dioxide fumigation process, where we collect in an impinger. Essentially, it's a time-weighted average concentration determination using titration. Through that, we can evaluate the concentrations throughout the office. Once we achieve those concentrations we're looking for, we would then go through a scrubbing process, which would simply be the introduction of a caustic and bisulfite solution being stripped through the emitter and then subsequently reacting with the chlorine dioxide in the room.
The bisulfate solution was used to ensure complete destruction of the ClO2. Finally, after 16 hours, the initial fumigation cycle was complete. Post-operation confirmation sampling and analysis revealed that additional treatment would be required to kill a small quantity of spores still remaining in the Dashel suite and the ventilation system. Teams went to work erecting a scaled-back version of the gassing system that could treat roughly 3,000 cubic feet. The revamped system could also be operated and monitored from the Hart Building's underground parking garage. Along with the Dashel suite fumigation, 11 additional areas in Hart and other tainted buildings were disinfected using a variety of methodologies, such as liquid chlorine dioxide, foams, and HEPA vacuuming. Separate work teams were also collecting mail, personal, and desktop items from offices to be decontaminated off-site in what was dubbed the critical item removal. Crews working inside makeshift isolation chambers double-bagged items and placed spore strips inside for confirmation of bacteria disinfection. After being cleaned with a decon solution, the bags were loaded into tubs, and finally into large Gaylord boxes, typically holding 400 to 500 pounds. A logistics contractor then loaded the boxes into trucks for transport 100 miles to Richmond, Virginia, where the critical items would be sterilized with ethylene oxide.
We provide that chain of custody along with the actual transportation. We inventory these Gaylord boxes, these large containers, as they're put on the truck. They are sealed and they are controlled by an individual barcode. And there is a DDD courier that accompanies the entire shipment as it's transported down here via surface transportation, tractor trailer primarily. When they're received down here, they're inventoried again to make sure that the same number of pallets have been received.
The critical items are then put through a 20 to 24-hour ethylene oxide sterilization process that kills any anthrax spores in or on the items. The process is used extensively to disinfect medical equipment and clean sensitive museum artifacts and documents. The containers are first warmed in a pre-treatment chamber to bring the material back up to normal room temperature. After pre-treatment, they're moved to the sterilization chamber for a process somewhat similar to the Hart fumigation, but on a much smaller scale. A vacuum is pulled to remove oxygen from the chamber. Heated nitrogen is then introduced, which purges any remaining oxygen and raises product temperature. The nitrogen is vacuumed out and steam is introduced to raise humidity, which preconditions the materials for the receipt of the ethylene oxide. Ethylene oxide is then pumped into the chamber for approximately 6 hours. The pressurized gas diffuses and becomes uniform throughout the chamber, penetrating all products in an equal concentration, effectively killing the anthrax bacteria without damaging the contents. After sterilization levels have been reached, the ethylene oxide is vacuumed from the chamber. The chamber is then subjected to a series of nitrogen washes to ensure the removal of any trace levels of the toxic gas. Air is then introduced and atmospheric pressure is normalized. The boxes are then removed from the treatment chamber and placed in another cell where they receive a 4-hour ambient air wash before being returned to Capitol Hill, where the team was working around the clock on the redesigned ClO2 gassing system in the Hart Building garage. Under intense media scrutiny, the Capitol Hill team remained vigilant, not losing sight that persistence and patience would be essential to clean up the unprecedented biological attack.
Like any operation, there's a desire to figure out the quick fix and do something in the most expeditious manner possible. Although everybody's trying to achieve that, people understand it's going to take time. We may have setbacks throughout this. People put in incredibly long hours, working 12-hour days, 24 hours a day.
It didn't matter what organization you came from, you were with the Capitol Hill team, and you were working towards accomplishing the task that we were working on, which was to resolve this anthrax problem.
On Sunday night, December 16th, the gas was circulated through the ventilation system, but was aborted the next day after saturation levels could not be sustained. After some modifications to ensure that humidity levels would remain near 75%, a final 4-day effort to kill trace amounts of remaining spores kicked off on Friday, December 28th. Test results of the treatment, reviewed by the Centers for Disease Control and EPA, finally declared the Hart building safe for reoccupancy. Finally, on January 22nd, the Hart Senate building was officially reopened. Congressional staffers, who for the last 3 months had been sharing phones and computers in cramped temporary offices, could now return.
We have always felt that it was important to put safety over convenience. This was the biggest biological attack in our nation's history, and I think it's really remarkable that in spite of that fact, we are all healthy. Our staffs are healthy, and our attitude is good.
It's back to the business of government on Capitol Hill. But research on anthrax remediation and biological warfare agents continues. Lessons learned from the attacks and the resulting cleanups will be assessed and used in the future.
We believe we've accomplished something here that hasn't been done before, and of course we're still learning. Based on what we've learned, we're going to try to let people across the country, across the world, know what we've learned from this, what we've done wrong, what we've done right. If anyone runs into this again, they'll have a skeletal outline from which to move.